First watershed plan for Squam was done in 1991, and when I got involved in around 2016, 2015, around there, it really had been a number of years since the first watershed plan had been created. And the watershed plan really guides the restoration projects, water quality monitoring for an organization like the Squam Lakes Association and the towns that participate with this SLA as well. And so it was really thought that it was time to update this plan, and there's federal funding that will help support such a plan. And so we started to apply for grants. I think we did a couple iterations of grant rounds before we were actually successful in getting some federal funding administered through the Department of Environmental Services. But really, we were reaching a point where at the SLA, we had decades of water quality data. And really, do you want to sit there and watch the long, slow decline that happens to really any glacial lake in New Hampshire? Or do you want to actually do something about it? And the watershed plan provides a funding structure and the framework to address water quality issues in the lake. We have on Squam a data set that goes back to 1979. It's one of the biggest data sets, or longest data sets in the state for water quality monitoring. And so that's a great foundation to start looking at what's happening today. It lets us compare the same data points that you're collecting today with what was happening 30 or 40 years ago. So that gives you an idea of how things might be changing decade by decade, month by month, year by year. You can look at it in so many different ways. It would really be awful or a terrible thing to stop doing that water quality monitoring, because you would lose that ability to compare what was happening in the past. But what was happening in 1979 is not the same thing that's happening today. So there's different parameters that you could be looking at to determine what water quality is. There's different ways you can be looking at it, different time frames you can be looking at it. So keeping a sort of a foot into how water quality has been monitored for decades is important, but also making sure that you're forward looking and collecting modern water quality data parameters that are going to help you deal with the issues of the future. Many people were not thinking about climate change in 1979. So things like monitoring something like where the thermocline is, so the depth at which the water temperature starts changing in the summer, that wasn't actually tracked until decades later. So just as an example of something that's at a clear and modern threat to a lake such as Squam, is not something that we were actually monitoring for 40 years ago. So I think the biggest threat to New Hampshire lakes in general is stormwater. And this is something that stormwater is going to be carrying pollutants such as sediment and nutrients into the lake that can then fuel algae blooms. It can then fuel cyanobacteria blooms and things like that are real and very immediate threats to the lake. And it also can, as you see more sediment into the lake and nutrients, it's the same thing as you fertilize your garden to see green growth. It's a bad thing in lakes, and all lakes are moving from all glacial lakes are moving from a place of cold, clear waters to a mucky swamp. That's it should be a millennia of evolution and tens of thousands of years. So if we exacerbate that through what would be called cultural eutrophication and the human impact of accelerating those nutrients and sediments, getting them into the lake, that's, I think, one of the biggest threats to the lake itself. If you drive around Squam, you can see places where there are major erosion issues. You can see channels where water has moved into the lake, and if you happen to catch that right after a storm that's an inch or two or even greater, then you'll actually see the impact in the lake itself. The lake will have a sediment plume. Now that in and of itself is bad, but then you take something such as climate change, where we're seeing higher intensity storms that are greater than 2 inches, and they're happening more frequently, and they're often happening in time. We're not seeing those stretches of rainy days as much anymore. So we end up getting these intense storms after a period of dryness. And so it's not the amount of sediment that rain can carry into a body of water like a lake is not linear. So you tend to get more sediment and more phosphorus that goes into a lake early in those storms, and that's definitely exacerbated with dry soil conditions. So climate change is going to accelerate an issue that would be an issue without climate change as well. We look today at a lake that has pretty excellent water quality in a lot of ways, and we know that because it's been monitored for over 40 years. But really, the science of the late 70s is not the science of today. And you really can't collect the science of today and tomorrow with the equipment that we've been using for decades. So keeping up with equipment, it goes obsolete, it breaks. The original thermometers that were used they're stored in pencil cases. Those don't really work anymore. So to be able to keep up with what's happening on Squam, we need to make sure that we have modern equipment. And it's not just keeping up with the data that we have now, we also have the ability to put data loggers and be able to collect so much more data. The ability to process that data is much more rich and possible than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So the SLA, when it was founded in 1904, was really ahead of the game. It was ahead of its time. And you see other comparable organizations that maybe didn't start for decades later. And they were really addressing the threats of the time. A lot of that, the watershed would look completely different to us if we looked at it 115 years ago. There'd be fewer trees, different types of pollution. And the SLA was formed really to address the pollution that was existing at the time. And things are a lot different more than a century later. But we have the opportunity to continue to be ahead of the game if we can address modern threats to water quality.